Gentlelady yields back. The chair will now recognize the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Brooks.
Secretary Clinton, I'd like to ask you a bit about your decision-making and the discussions you had as it related to how long the Benghazi mission itself was going to last. I'm putting up a map just because most of us really don't know much about Libya, don't know much about the geography of Libya, and as we've talked about these various communities, I don't think most people really realized. So I want to share with you that we know from my last round that Chris Stevens went into Benghazi in April of 2011. I want to talk to you about what happened the rest of that year. And just because there was a lot going on, I thought it would be helpful to have this map. So by mid-July, our government formally recognized the TNC as the official government of Libya, replacing the Gaddafi regime. And TNC was based in Benghazi at that time. And then in August, after the Gaddafi government fell, Gaddafi went over into, he left Tripoli, where Gaddafi had been headquartered, and he went into hiding in Sirte. Now, once that happened, the TNC moved their Benghazi headquarters over to Tripoli. And then in September, we reopened our embassy in Tripoli, and Ambassador Kretz returned. He had been evacuated previously, and Chris Stevens stayed in Benghazi. Does that sound like an accurate summary of the summer of 2011?
It does sound accurate, except I'm not sure exactly the duration of Ambassador Stevens' presence in Benghazi during those months.
Well, that leads to my next question. What was your plan for the mission in the fall of 2011 and going forward? What were the discussions you had, and who did you have those discussions with about the mission of Benghazi going forward in 2011?
Well, as you may have heard, Congresswoman, the email that Congresswoman Sanchez introduced into the record.
What was your plan for the mission in the fall of 2011?
Was from the fall of 2011, and there was quite a discussion going on between officials in the State Department, in the intelligence community, in both Washington and Libya about the path forward. The Transitional National Council had been based in Benghazi, and there was a dispute even within the Libyans themselves as to whether they would split the government, whether the government would be located predominantly but not exclusively in Tripoli, or as some were hoping, predominantly but not exclusively in Benghazi. So this was all a very live subject that was being debated, both in Libya and with respect to what our response would be in Washington. So we at Chris Stevens' strong urging, and that of other of our experienced diplomats, wanted to maintain a presence in Benghazi in some form. We reopened our embassy in Tripoli, which had been the historic.
What was your plan for the mission in the fall of 2011?
Capital, certainly under Gaddafi. But this was a constant discussion about what we should do, when and where, and I think that's why this email from Chris Stevens about his recommendations is so informative.
Well, and thank you, and I'll get to that in just a moment, but I have to ask you, I assume that your Chief of Staff, Cheryl Mills, was intimately involved in these discussions with you and with your top staff. She's one of your staff, as you were referring to them, is that right?
Well, she covered a broad range of issues. I'm sure she was involved in some of the discussions, but she had many other responsibilities, so I can't say all of them.
I'd like to refer you to an update on Tripoli operations provided to Cheryl Mills on September 14th. And at the top of that two-page memo, assumptions for Benghazi in September were gradual winding down of operations over the next 6 months, transition to Tripoli only by January 2012, no consulate. No consulate meant no consulate in Benghazi. This was in September. Would that be fair and accurate? And would you Were you in that briefing with Ms. Mills, or did she brief you about the fact that in September, the game plan was to shut down Benghazi?
Well, I think you have to look at that in context, Congresswoman. There was not an active plan for a consulate in Benghazi at any point during this period. That is not what the compound in Benghazi was. It was a temporary facility placed there to help us make a determination as to what we would need going forward in Benghazi.
What are you babbling about?
There was
Madam
a
Secretary.
strong argument that Chris Stevens and others made that they hoped eventually there might be a consulate, but there was never an agreement to have a consulate.
And in fact, if it had been deemed a consulate, it would have had a different level of security. Is that correct? Than a temporary mission compound?
Well,
Isn't that accurate, that consulates have certain levels of security? There are standards, there are protocols. When it is a consulate, it gets a certain level of security.
That is the hoped for outcome. That is not what happens in the very beginning in many places, especially the hot spots and the conflict areas where a consulate is stood up.
Can you talk with me about the decision then? There is a briefing with respect to, after the closing rather, of the consulate in Benghazi by January of 2012. We know it didn't close. It did not close. You went to Tripoli in October of 2011. Ambassador Kretz was still there. How about Chris Stevens? Did Chris Stevens come over from Benghazi to see you when you went for that big trip in October 11?
I don't recall. I don't recall if he did or not. This was about Ambassador Kretz, and Ambassador Kretz was the person that we were meeting with at that time.
I didn't do it.
What was your purpose for meeting with Ambassador Kretz if Chris Stevens was your expert in Libya?
Ambassador Kretz was an expert as well. Ambassador Kretz was our ambassador. You remember, as I mentioned to you before, he had been our ambassador, and then because he reported very accurately about what he observed regarding Gaddafi and Gaddafi's henchmen, when WikiLeaks disclosed internal U.S. government cables, and Gene Kretz's cables were publicized, talking very critically about Gaddafi. He was then subjected to threats, and then we took him out. We did not close the embassy at that time.
What are you babbling about?
So he had returned to finish out his time, and we were in the process of moving him to another assignment and nominating Chris Stevens to replace him.
But you didn't, during that one trip to Libya, you didn't talk to Chris Stevens, best of your recollection.
While I was in
time.
Libya, I don't recall that. Of course, we consulted with him with respect to planning the trip as to who we would meet with, what we would ask for. We were trying very hard to get the people in positions of authority at that time in Libya to let us work with them on everything from border security to collecting weapons and trying to disarm the militias. We had a lot of business we were doing with them.
So going back to Ms. Sanchez's email with respect from John Stevens to Ms. Polishek, it talks about option A, as you pointed out, slimming down the compound. And so he weighed in on, in October, he was weighing in on whether or not the compound should stay open. But I'd like to direct your attention to an email that's at tab 4, dated December 15th from Chris Stevens. And I might add for the record, we do not still to this day have all of Chris Stevens' emails. We received 1,300 more this week. We received most of them last week. We don't have the universe yet of Ambassador Stevens' emails, but he emailed to a reporting officer who we know was in Benghazi still. He wrote, "Interesting. Has security improved in Benghazi in recent weeks? Also curious what you guys decided to do regarding future of the compound." He was in Washington, D.C., or back in the States during that time. And in December, Ambassador Stevens, your soon-to-be ambassador, didn't know what was going to happen with the compound in Benghazi. How is that possible?
Well, Congresswoman, one of the great attributes that Chris Stevens had was a really good sense of humor.
What are you babbling about?
Ambassador Stevens, your soon-to-be ambassador, didn't know what was going to happen with the compound in Benghazi? How is that possible?
And I just see him smiling as he's typing this, because it is clearly in response to the email down below talking about picking up a few, quote, fire sale items from the Brits. And
Those
it's
fire
just-
sale items, by the way, fire sale items are barricades.
That's right.
They are additional
That's right.
requests for security for
That's
the
right.
compound. That's
Well-
what that fire sale was, because we weren't providing enough physical security for the compound. Isn't that right? So they're picking up a fire sale because other consulates are pulling out, other countries are pulling out.
Did you personally review our security situation as the previous ARB required?
Well,
I don't
I
think
thought it
that's
showed their
very funny.
entrepreneurial spirit, Congresswoman,
Absolutely.
and I applaud them for doing so. We did respond to a number of the security requests, the physical security requests. The posters that were up earlier this morning were only about the number of diplomatic security personnel. You're talking about physical barriers, physical additions to the compound. There were quite a few of those that were undertaken.
But how is it that Mr. Stevens did not know in December whether or not the compound was going to remain open?
Well-
or do you think that was a joke he was making?
Well, I think that if it were not an example of his sense of humor, it was also as part of the ongoing discussion about Mission Benghazi's future, which he went to great lengths to describe what he thought should be done. You know, a lot of it was trying to decide, could we afford it? Could we maintain it? What did we need to have there? So, yes, there was an ongoing discussion. And I think he knew he was going to be in line to go to Tripoli, and he wanted to know exactly what the decision was going to be about the compound. He had weighed in, not only in that email, but in numerous discussions with his colleagues back at the State Department.
Finally, Secretary Clinton, we know that the compound, the Benghazi mission, was extended for yet another year, because that same month, your Benghazi point person here in Washington, Jeff Feltman, sent a memo wanting to extend Benghazi through 2012, and he sent it to Undersecretary Patrick Kennedy, who approved it. Another high-level official, who, by the way, for the record, State Department has given us none of Undersecretary Patrick Kennedy's emails yet. Same with Jeffrey Feltman, very high-level officials within the State Department. Are you familiar with that memo sent on December 27th entitled Future of Operations in Benghazi, Libya? Are you familiar with that memo?
Well,
And if so, did Assistant Secretary Feltman discuss that memo with you at the time and discuss extending the mission in Benghazi in December of 11?
I'm familiar that there was an ongoing discussion about the future of the mission in Benghazi.
A discussion between whom, ma'am? Who were
between all of the relevant officials in the State Department.
Help me with understanding.
Well, Jeff
who those
Feltman was
were.
one of them.
Okay. Who
Obviously,
else?
Chris Stevens was one of them, but there were many others who had information and expertise to add to it, and there was a recommendation that Benghazi be continued through 2012.
Did you personally review our security situation as the previous ARB required?
As part of the continuing evaluation of whether or what we wanted to have on a more permanent basis in Benghazi.
And do you recall, were you in those discussions? Were you specifically in those meetings? You've shared that you didn't do a lot by email, that you had more meetings and briefings. Were you in those meetings about extending Benghazi through the end of the year?
There were certainly meetings in which I was advised about the process being undertaken as to determine whether the Benghazi should be extended. So yes, I was aware of the process that was ongoing, and I was kept up to date about it.
And were there any minutes or any briefings?
Gentlelady, did you personally review our security situation as the previous ARB required? Did you personally review our security situation as the previous ARB required?